I guess the beginning of the end started when Jessica began spending an unusual amount of time at the local coffee shop. She'd always been a coffee lover, but her newfound obsession with Brewed Bliss seemed a bit extreme. We'd been married for nearly 15 years, and while we had our ups and downs, I never imagined we'd end up here, teetering on the edge of destruction. Jessica and I met in college. She was this fiery, independent woman who had a zest for life that was infectious. I was drawn to her energy and the way she could light up a room with her smile. We got married after graduation, and for a while, life was pretty great. We traveled, built our careers, and made a cozy home together. We decided early on that kids weren't for us, which gave us the freedom to pursue our passions without the constraints of parenting. But over the last year or so, things began to change. Jessica's job had gotten more demanding, and she seemed to retreat into her own world more often. She started working from home, which I thought would be great for us, giving us more time together. Instead, it seemed to create a distance between us. She'd be on her laptop for hours, hardly looking up when I entered the room. Our conversations became more transactional, focused on logistics and daily routines rather than the dreams and plans we used to share. I tried to be supportive, thinking maybe it was just a rough patch, but there were signs I couldn't ignore. She became more secretive with her phone, always keeping it face down or taking it with her everywhere. She started going out more, always with some vague excuse about needing to clear her head or run errands. And then there was the coffee shop. Brewed Bliss was Jessica's new sanctuary. She'd spend hours there, more than what seemed reasonable for someone who just wanted a good cup of coffee. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming she just liked the atmosphere. But then she started coming home with this strange glow, a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. I tried to ask her about it, but she'd brush me off, claiming she was just enjoying a change of scenery from working at home. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I began to pay closer attention, noticing the little things she thought she hid so well. The way she'd smile at her phone, the hushed phone calls, and the way she started dressing up more than usual just to grab a coffee. It all started to add up, creating a picture I didn't want to see. Still, I held on to hope. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe she was just going through something she didn't know how to talk about. I wanted to believe that our love was stronger than whatever was pulling her away. But as the days turned into weeks, my doubts grew, gnawing at me from the inside. I had to know what was really going on. And so, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Little did I know, the discovery would shatter the very foundation of our life together. The growing distance between us gnawed at me until I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, after another long, awkwardly silent dinner, I decided to go to Brewed Bliss and see for myself what was drawing Jessica there so often. It was late, well past the usual closing time, but I had a feeling something was up. When I arrived, the lights were still on, but the "closed" sign hung in the window. The door was locked. I peered inside, trying to see through the dimly lit interior. Nothing seemed out of place at first, just the usual coffee shop setup with tables and chairs neatly arranged. But then, through the small crack in the curtain, I saw movement towards the back. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized this could be my chance to get some answers. I circled the building, searching for a way in. Around the back, I found a slightly open window. It was a tight squeeze, but desperation fueled my determination. I pushed it open and slipped inside. The interior was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I moved quietly, making my way towards the back where I had seen the movement. As I got closer, I began to hear muffled voices, punctuated by soft laughter and the unmistakable sounds of intimacy. My stomach churned as the reality of what I was about to witness hit me. I turned the corner and saw them. Jessica was sprawled out on one of the tables, her skirt hiked up around her waist, and the barista, a guy I vaguely recognized from a few visits, was between her legs. The sight was like a punch to the gut. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. They were completely oblivious to my presence, lost in their own world of illicit pleasure. Jessica's moans filled the air, mingling with the barista's grunts as he thrust into her with a ferocity that made me sick to my stomach. I wanted to look away, to turn and leave. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch the woman I loved betray me in the most intimate way possible. Every second felt like an eternity. My rage boiled over, and before I knew it, I was moving towards them. The barista looked up first, his eyes widening in shock and fear as he saw me. He stumbled back, trying to cover himself, but it was too late. I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him off Jessica, throwing him to the floor. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty coffee shop. Jessica scrambled to cover herself, her face a mix of shock, fear, and something else. Defiance. She looked at me, her eyes blazing. "How dare you follow me here?" she screamed, as if I was the one who had done something wrong. The sheer audacity of her response was like gasoline on the fire of my anger. "I dare. I fucking dare!" I yelled back, my voice shaking with fury. "You're the one cheating on me, f***ing this guy right on the table where people drink their coffee!" The barista, still cowering on the floor, tried to speak. "I didn't know she was married, man! I swear!" I cut him off with a glare that could melt steel. "Shut up! This isn't about you! It's about her!" I said, pointing at Jessica, who was now standing, her clothes hastily rearranged but still disheveled. Jessica crossed her arms, her defiance morphing into something colder. "You were never around, always working late, always too busy for me. What did you expect me to do? Sit around and wait for you to care?" Her words cut deep, but they didn't justify what she had done. "So this is my fault? You're blaming me for your betrayal?" I asked, incredulous. She shrugged, a bitter smile on her lips. "If you weren't such a boring, predictable husband, maybe I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." The coldness in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was who she had become. A liar, a cheat, and someone who clearly no longer cared about our marriage. I turned to the barista, who was slowly backing away towards the door. "Get out, now!" I growled. He didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his clothes and bolted, leaving me alone with Jessica. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Why, Jessica? Why him? Why here?" I asked, my voice breaking. She looked at me, her expression softening just a fraction. "I don't know, okay? It just happened. I felt alive with him. It was exciting, something different." "Different?" I echoed, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "Different from what? From us? From me?" She didn't answer, and in that silence, I found my own answer. Our marriage, our life together, it had become something she no longer wanted. And now, as I stood there in the ruins of our relationship, I realized I needed to decide what came next. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Jessica behind. The door closed with a heavy thud, sealing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, filled with uncertainty and the painful task of moving on. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more painful than the last. How had it come to this? How had the woman I loved turned into someone I barely recognized? The betrayal was like a knife in my chest, twisting with every breath. I needed answers. But more than that, I needed to confront Jessica properly, on my terms. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for a few moments, trying to gather my thoughts. The house looked the same as always, calm, inviting, a facade of normalcy hiding the chaos within. I took a deep breath and went inside, knowing that this confrontation was inevitable. Jessica was already there, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, looking annoyingly composed for someone who had just been caught in the act. She glanced up as I walked in, her expression a mix of defiance and something else I couldn't quite place. Perhaps a hint of guilt. I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at her, waiting for her to say something. Anything. "Are we really going to do this here?" she finally asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yes, we are," I replied, my voice cold. "You owe me that much at least." She sighed, setting down her glass. "Fine. What do you want to know?" "Everything," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay calm. "How long has this been going on? Why him? Why there?" Jessica looked away, staring at a spot on the wall, as if it held the answers to all my questions. "It's been a few months," she said quietly. "I met him at the coffee shop. He was different. Young. Fun. He made me feel alive." "Alive?" I echoed, feeling a sickening sense of déjà vu. "You think f***ing some barista on a coffee shop table makes you feel alive? What about our life, Jess? What about everything we've built together? She looked back at me, her eyes hardening. Our life? What life, Nathan? You've been so busy with work, with your own world, you didn't even notice when I started slipping away. I was lonely, and he was there. He listened, he cared. The anger I felt was almost overwhelming. So it's my fault? You're blaming me for your decision to cheat? I'm not blaming you, she said, standing up and facing me. I'm just explaining how it happened. You were never here, Nathan. I needed more than what you were giving me. More! You needed more? I shouted, unable to control my emotions any longer. I gave you everything. I worked hard to provide for us, to make sure we had a good life, and this is how you repay me. She crossed her arms, looking more irritated than remorseful. You think money and a nice house are everything? I needed you, Nathan, not just your paycheck. Then why didn't you say something? Why didn't you talk to me instead of jumping into bed with him? I demanded, my voice hoarse. Because I tried! She yelled back, tears welling up in her eyes. I tried to talk to you, but you were always too busy, too distracted. I was tired of feeling like I was invisible. Her words hit me hard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. Maybe there was some truth to what she was saying. Maybe I had been too focused on work, too caught up in my own world. But it still didn't excuse what she had done. I'm sorry you felt that way, I said, my voice trembling. But cheating on me, lying to me, that's not the answer. You broke us, Jessica. You broke me? She looked away, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I'm sorry, but it's too late now, isn't it? I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Yeah, it is. I can't stay in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. I deserve better than that. She didn't say anything, just nodded in agreement. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the ghosts of what once was and the reality of what had become. I'll pack my things, she said quietly. I'll stay at a friend's place until we figure out the next steps. I nodded, unable to speak. As she walked past me towards the bedroom, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. This was the end of our story, the final chapter in a book that had been full of love and laughter, now tainted by betrayal. As I stood there alone in the living room, I realized that this was just the beginning of a new, uncertain journey. One that I would have to face without the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. But despite the pain, I knew I had to move forward, for my own sake, and for the chance to find happiness again. The days that followed were a blur of pain, anger, and disbelief. Every corner of the house was filled with memories of Jessica, of us. The couch where we used to snuggle on movie nights, the kitchen where we shared countless meals and conversations, the bedroom that had seen both our love and now our heartbreak. It all felt tainted, like a museum of a life that no longer existed. I tried to go through the motions of daily life, but everything felt hollow. I went to work, attended meetings, and interacted with colleagues, but my mind was always elsewhere. The betrayal was a constant weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Nights were the worst. The bed felt too big, too empty. I lay awake for hours, replaying everything in my mind, the signs I'd missed, the lies she'd told. The moment I found them together, it was a relentless loop of pain and regret. I kept wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have saved our marriage. But every thought ended with the same realization. Jessica had made her choice, and there was nothing I could do to change that. One night, after a particularly brutal day at work, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of us on vacations, at parties, just being happy. Each image was a punch to the gut, a reminder of what we'd lost. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, quickly followed by another. Before I knew it, I was sobbing, the dam of my emotions finally breaking. It was the first time I truly let myself feel the depth of my pain. I cried for the love we had, for the trust she'd shattered, for the future we'd never have. And in that moment, I realized that this was a necessary step. I needed to grieve, to mourn the loss of our marriage before I could even begin to think about moving on. The next morning, I decided to take a day off work. I needed time to process everything, to start figuring out how to rebuild my life. I spent the day walking through the city, letting the noise and activity wash over me. It felt good to be outside, away from the reminders of what had happened. I ended up at a small park, sitting on a bench and watching the world go by. Couples walked hand in hand, children played, and life continued, oblivious to my personal turmoil. It was a stark reminder that while my world had crumbled, the rest of the world kept turning. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number of my best friend, Mike. We hadn't spoken much lately, but I needed someone to talk to, someone who knew me and could offer some perspective. Mike answered on the third ring, his familiar voice a comforting sound. "Hey man, it's been a while," he said. "Yeah, it has," I replied, my voice shaky. "I need to talk. Can we meet up?" "Of course. How about we grab a drink at our usual spot?" I agreed, feeling a small sense of relief. Mike had always been there for me, through thick and thin. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was him. Later that evening, we met at our favorite bar. Mike took one look at me and knew something was wrong. We found a quiet corner, ordered a couple of beers, and I began to tell him everything. From Jessica's increasing distance to the night I found her with the barista to the painful confrontation at home. Mike listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he took a deep breath and shook his head. "Jesus, Nathan, I had no idea things were that bad." "Neither did I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought we were just going through a rough patch. I never imagined she'd do something like this." Mike leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Look, man, you didn't deserve this. None of it. You've been a good husband, a good man. This isn't on you." His words were a balm to my wounded heart, but the pain was still there, raw and unrelenting. "Then why do I feel like I failed?" "Because you're human," he said simply. "You care, and that's not a bad thing. But you need to stop blaming yourself. Jessica made her choices, and they're on her, not you." I nodded, taking a long sip of my beer. "I just don't know how to move on from this. It's like everything I knew was a lie." "It's going to take time," Mike said, his voice gentle. "You're going to have good days and bad days. But you'll get through this. You're stronger than you think." We spent the rest of the evening talking, reminiscing about old times and making plans to hang out more. By the time we parted ways, I felt a little lighter, a little more hopeful. Mike's support was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that I had people who cared about me. Over the next few weeks, I began to take small steps towards healing. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Karen, who helped me navigate the tangled web of my emotions. She encouraged me to journal, to express my feelings in words, and it became a therapeutic outlet for my pain. Work became a refuge, a place where I could focus on something other than my personal life. My colleagues noticed the change in me, and while they didn't pry, their support was palpable. I threw myself into projects, staying late to keep my mind occupied. I also reconnected with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years because I was so wrapped up in my life with Jessica. They welcomed me back with open arms, offering distractions and a sense of normalcy that I desperately needed. One evening, as I sat in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of our shared life, I realized that while the pain was still there, it wasn't as suffocating as it had been. I was starting to find my footing again, to rebuild myself piece by piece, and in that moment, I knew that while the road ahead would be long and difficult, I had the strength to walk it. I would survive this, and eventually, I would thrive. The decision to divorce Jessica came with a heavy heart but a clear mind. The betrayal was too deep, the trust too shattered to ever rebuild our marriage. As painful as it was, I knew it was the right choice for both of us. Holding on to a relationship built on lies and deceit would only bring more pain. I reached out to a divorce lawyer named Emma, who came highly recommended by a colleague. She was known for her tenacity and empathy, a combination I desperately needed. During our first meeting, Emma listened carefully as I recounted everything that had happened. Her calm demeanor and professional advice were reassuring in the midst of my emotional turmoil. "Nathan, it's clear that this situation has deeply affected you," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. "But I want you to know that you have rights, and we will ensure that this process is as fair and painless as possible." We discussed the logistics of the divorce, the division of assets, the settlement, and the legal procedures. Jessica and I didn't have children, which simplified things somewhat, but there were still numerous details to iron out. Emma was thorough, ensuring that every aspect of the separation was covered, The day I served Jessica with the divorce papers was a mix of dread and relief. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe we used to frequent when we were first dating. It was a painful irony that the place once filled with happy memories would now be the backdrop for our final chapter. Jessica arrived, looking weary but composed. She sat across from me, and for a moment we simply stared at each other, the weight of our shared past hanging between us. I slid the papers across the table, my heart pounding in my chest. "These are the divorce papers," I said quietly. "It's time we make this official." She looked down at the papers, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if she would fight it, try to convince me to give our marriage another chance. But then she sighed, a sound filled with resignation. "I understand," she said softly. "I knew this was coming. I'm sorry it had to end this way." I nodded, unable to find the right words. "It's for the best. We both need to move on." She signed the papers with a steady hand, her face betraying no emotion. Once she was done, she handed them back to me, and for a brief moment, our fingers brushed. It was a fleeting connection, a final touch that felt both sad and necessary. "I hope you find happiness, Nathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," I replied, my throat tight. "I hope you do too." We left the cafe separately, each walking away from the life we had built together. As I watched her disappear down the street, I felt a strange sense of closure. The chapter of our marriage was officially over, and it was time to start writing a new one. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved forward smoothly. Emma handled the details with efficiency and care, ensuring that everything was fair and equitable. Jessica and I communicated only through our lawyers, which made the process less emotionally charged. During this time, I focused on rebuilding my life. I moved out of the house we had shared, finding a new apartment that felt like a fresh start. The process of moving was cathartic, a way to shed the remnants of our broken marriage and create a space that was truly mine. Decorating the new place was surprisingly enjoyable. I chose furniture and decor that reflected my tastes, creating a sanctuary that felt like home. It was a small but significant step towards reclaiming my identity and my independence. Work continued to be a refuge, and I found myself more engaged and productive than ever. My colleagues noticed the change in me, and their support was a constant source of encouragement. I also continued my therapy sessions with Dr. Karen, who helped me navigate the complex emotions that came with the end of my marriage. One evening, as I sat in my new living room, I reflected on the journey I had been on. The pain of Jessica's betrayal was still there, but it was no longer the all-consuming force it had once been. I was healing, slowly but surely, and I was starting to see a future filled with possibilities. I had also started to reconnect with friends and family, people I had neglected during my marriage. Their support and understanding were invaluable, reminding me that I was not alone in this journey. I even began to explore new hobbies and interests, things that I had put on hold for too long. The day the divorce was finalized, Emma called me with the news. "It's done, Nathan. You're officially divorced." The words were a bittersweet relief. "Thank you, Emma, for everything." "You're welcome. Take care of yourself. And remember, this is a new beginning." As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in a long time. The legal bond between Jessica and me was broken, and while the emotional scars would take time to heal, I was ready to embrace the future. That evening, I decided to celebrate this new chapter. I invited Mike and a few close friends over for a small gathering. We laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. As the night wound down, Mike pulled me aside. "I'm proud of you, man. You've been through hell, but you came out stronger." I smiled, feeling the truth of his words. "Thanks, Mike. I couldn't have done it without you." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my glass with his. As I looked around at the faces of my friends, I realized that I was no longer defined by the pain of my past. I was Nathan, a man with a future full of promise. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where that future would take me. Months passed, and with each day, I felt the sting of Jessica's betrayal fading into the background. Life slowly began to take on a new rhythm, one that I embraced with cautious optimism. My new apartment became a sanctuary, a place where I could rediscover myself and explore new interests without the shadows of my past haunting every corner. Therapy with Dr. Karen continued to be a cornerstone of my recovery. Each session peeled back layers of pain and resentment, helping me understand not only Jessica's actions, but also my own. I learned to forgive myself for the things I couldn't control and to recognize the patterns that had led us down such a destructive path. One afternoon, during a particularly reflective session, Dr. Karen asked, "Nathan, what do you want your future to look like?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. For so long, my future had been tied to Jessica, our plans, our dreams. Now, with that chapter closed, the future was a blank canvas. "I want to be happy," I said slowly. "I want to build a life that's fulfilling, with people who care about me and respect me. I want to find someone who values trust and honesty as much as I do." Dr. Karen smiled. "That's a good place to start. But remember, it's also about finding fulfillment within yourself, not just in a relationship." Her words resonated deeply. I had spent so much of my life defining myself by my relationships, first with Jessica, and now in my pursuit of a new one. But true happiness, I realized, needed to come from within. Inspired by this newfound clarity, I threw myself into activities that brought me joy. I took up photography again, capturing the beauty of the city and the quiet moments of everyday life. I joined a hiking club, exploring trails and making new friends who shared my love of the outdoors. Through these activities, I began to rebuild my social circle. I met people who were positive, supportive, and fun to be around. One of those people was Emma, my lawyer. We stayed in touch after the divorce, and what started as occasional lunches to discuss legal matters soon turned into genuine friendship. Emma was everything Jessica wasn't: warm, empathetic, and fiercely loyal. She had a way of making me feel seen and valued, qualities I hadn't realized I was missing until they were right in front of me. Our friendship grew slowly and organically, without the pressure of expectations. One evening, after a particularly strenuous hike, we sat on a hill overlooking the city, the lights twinkling below us. Emma turned to me, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "You seem happier, Nathan. Lighter." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words. "I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the air filled with the sounds of nature and the distant hum of the city. Eventually, Emma broke the silence. "I've been thinking about us, Nathan. About how our friendship has grown." My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, me too." She looked at me, her expression serious but kind. "I care about you a lot, more than just a friend." Her words hung in the air, charged with emotion. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of hope and fear. "I care about you too, Emma. A lot." We both smiled, and in that moment, something shifted. The possibility of a new beginning, built on trust and mutual respect, was right there in front of us. We didn't rush into anything, choosing instead to let our relationship develop naturally, enjoying each other's company and building a foundation based on honesty and genuine connection. As months turned into a year, my life continued to evolve. I advanced in my career, finding fulfillment in my work and gaining the respect of my colleagues. My social circle expanded, filled with friends who supported and uplifted me. And my relationship with Emma blossomed into something beautiful and meaningful. One evening, as we sat on my balcony watching the sunset, Emma turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Nathan, you've come a long way. I'm proud of you." I looked at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and love. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my rock." She smiled, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "We make a good team." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, I realized that I had found what I was looking for, not just in Emma, but in myself. I had rebuilt my life from the ashes of betrayal, creating something stronger, more resilient, and filled with genuine happiness. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. I had learned to value myself, to seek out the things and people that brought joy into my life, and to let go of the past while embracing the future. As we sat there, hand in hand, watching the day turn into night, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. My story wasn't defined by Jessica's betrayal, but by my own strength and resilience. And with Emma by my side, I knew that the future held endless possibilities.